Rom. I'm Barbara Rand's daughter, and I'll be answering some of her questions today.
Well, Marissa, could you just give my students an example of your interests in social justice, going back to your work at non-governmental organizations in India, and then coming back and working in law school, and then now that you've graduated from law school, what you're going to be doing and how that relates to social justice, because we're studying occupational justice, which is a more fine-tuned look at issues of social justice, and I think they'll be interested.
Okay, well, I will explain, and then if I'm getting off track, just cue me. So I guess touching on the occupational justice aspects and what I did, after college I worked for a non-governmental organization in Bombay in India that was called Support, and we worked with homeless and street-involved youth. So a lot of these were young people who had run away from abusive families, or their families themselves had, for lack of other options, had to put them to work, and they ended up getting into conditions and situations where they were often exploited, both in terms of labor trafficking as well as sex trafficking. So my role in that organization is I served as a health educator, so I provided a culturally sensitive program for young girls mostly, although I did work with some of the boys as well who were really under-prioritized because they get very little funding in terms of anti-trafficking efforts. So that was very interesting to me to work in an organization that took a holistic approach to them, because a lot of them had drug addiction, a lot of them had a lot of mental health issues, and so those were really prioritized in the health education program before they decided whether they wanted to go back to school or ended up doing a vocational program. It was really a very survivor-centered look at rehabilitating these youth as much as possible on their terms as well. So do you want me to talk a little bit more about that? Or
Yes, and then how did that evolve to you wanting to go to law school and some of your interests in the community in terms of diverse populations and that?
So working there really sparked a lot of my interest in the anti-trafficking movement, and also just a lot of forced migration issues in general, because a lot of the children that were there were not just Indian nationals. Quite a lot were from Nepal and Bhutan, so they faced kind of complicated issues with not being native-born population, and so there were a whole host of other issues that they had to deal with, and the reasons that they had come to India and why they couldn't return. I mean, it was very, there was a complex set of issues there. And when I've been interested for a very long time in doing advocacy with underserved populations, and I think part of that is growing up biracial, not fitting in a particular box. It makes you more aware of people that are also not, who are getting missed in terms of prioritization because they don't fit into a box. And when I was in law school, I continued doing anti-trafficking work. I started a student-run clinic, and where we work on immigration issues, and we also do an education program in the juvenile halls to educate and prioritize minor girls who are in the juvenile justice system but have experienced commercial sexual exploitation, victims of pimping, things like that, who don't know their rights and their legal remedies. So that's sort of on the anti-trafficking angle. And then in terms of other advocacy, I did do quite a bit of refugee and asylum-related advocacy. I helped represent a a woman from El Salvador who was filing for asylum because partially through for reasons of domestic violence. And then this summer after my first year, I worked in Australia, and without going too into details because it is a bit complicated, Australia is sort of unique in that everyone who comes seeking asylum is mandatorily detained. So as I'm sure you can imagine, if somebody is coming seeking asylum, they're in fear for their life. It means that they are saying, I have a well-founded fear of persecution if I go back there. I'm scared for my life. And most of the asylum seekers that are in Australia that I worked with through an organization called the New Wales Council for Civil Liberties were coming from Afghanistan, Iran, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, especially post 2008 after the civil war in Sri Lanka. So as you can imagine, they had just had a whole host of traumatic issues they were dealing with. So the fact that not only were they carrying these burdens and memories of trauma and having to relive it by pursuing an asylum application because they have to explain all the horrible things that happened to them in order to show it's really that bad that they can't go back. So if you can imagine, this already is so traumatic, and they're in detention. So they're in a prison-like environment, and sometimes it was for years on end because it's a very politicized issue in Australia, and there's a lot of anti-immigration sentiments. And so the clients that we were working with were all just suffering from such mental health issues. And then they knew that they were being demonized in the press as these awful people who were just cheating and trying to make their way to Australia. And working with them and hearing their stories, I knew that wasn't true, but it really took a toll on them. And as much as they tried to stay positive, so many of them experienced depression. Every week when I would come in, I would hear a new story about a suicide attempt. And so it was really something that was frustrating to see that they were not being treated as survivors of trauma. They were being treated as almost, criminals. That's how they felt, being put in a detention center, which honestly, I visited the prisons there and it looked no different.
So how about an example of the children and some of the lack of occupations for them to do and what they ended up resorting to?
In Australia or back
Right,
in
in Australia. Remember there was an issue about a young child?
In Australia, so it wasn't necessarily an occupation issue. There was a young boy that ended up getting a lot of press because he and his family had come over on a boat. They were fleeing from Iran. They were a minority Kurdish group, and their boat crashed off the shore of the islands. And usually a lot of the sentiments in the press, I wish I was kidding, are, well, they deserve it for trying to come illegally, even though under international law, it's never illegal to seek asylum. And in fact, Australia was the signatory on the Refugee Convention that actually put it into place. So they have these obligations, and they know that. So there was all this sentiments, oh, well, they deserve this, until people realized the human impact on the sole survivor, who was a young boy who I believe was about 10 or 11. And there were some pictures taken because the family, there was some family in Sydney. That's why they were fleeing to Australia, because they had some family there. And there were pictures taken at the funeral, and you could just see how distressed and distraught this boy was, and it really changed some of the public sentiments when they saw that impact, because they were not presented as people. They were presented as cheaters who wanted to take advantage of, Australians' hard work, or, much like the immigration debate is here, unfortunately.
And then tell us about many of the things that they had no activities to do, and what kind of materials they had to use, and then what's one of the interned individuals actually made for you?
So the detainees, one of the biggest issues that they faced, and it sounds like it's not a big deal, but it really is just being bored. Because it just, for years there was one detainee who I was interviewing who had been there going on 4 years. And some of them were there even longer because even though they were recognized as refugees, which means they successfully proved that they would be persecuted and possibly even killed if they returned home, Australia said, well, we believe you have some adverse security issues because of the country you're from, and nowhere else will take you, and so you have to live in detention indefinitely, forever. And so, I mean, there were really not a lot of activities for them. They sometimes have religious groups come in and do some services. They had once in a while a language class, and these again are all volunteers. The government does not pay for this, but one professor at the University of Sydney was just so distraught over this, coming from an immigrant background himself, that he started a volunteer program called the Refugee Art Program, where he and his colleagues would come in the center and bring art materials. And it was just an incredible success because there was just so much emotion that these men and women were not able to express, and children too, that they could express through their art. And there were a lot of pictures of scenes from the Sri Lankan Civil War, pictures of barbed wire and what they saw every day, pictures of them being bound up to represent how they felt. And the program ended up getting canceled because the professor and his colleagues put on an art show with the materials, and it got a lot of publicity and really started people questioning why they were doing this detention program for people who were seeking asylum. And so the detention center, which is actually privatized, it's not owned by the government, not surprisingly, like everything in the US, it's owned by a private corporation, and they ended up canceling the program because they thought it was just getting too political. And so the detainees didn't have any more materials, so what they started to do with the leftover paper they had is they took instant coffee and powdered coffee, and mixed it with water to create enough, to create consistency, and then they would make their paintings out of coffee grounds, and they were really quite incredible.
Right, so can you tell them about what the one person gave you as a gift when you left?
Well, if we pause it, I can show them.